He replaced her with his younger assistant at a high-stakes business meeting, thinking her time was over. But Julia wasn't just a wife. She was the backbone of his empire. And when he least expected it, she returned with a plan so brilliant, it would leave him behind forever. The city lights flickered like distant stars outside the window of Ethan Collins' lavish penthouse. The glass walls framed the skyline, casting shimmering reflections of success across the room. Everything here was curated: minimalist furniture, rare artwork adorning the walls, and a grand crystal chandelier that hung like a crown over his empire. This wasn't just a home. It was a statement. Success lived here, breathed here, and tonight, success would have company. Ethan stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, his fingers wrapped around a glass of scotch, the amber liquid catching the glow of the city below. His tailored suit fit him like a second skin, emphasizing the broad shoulders and sharp jawline that had earned him respect in boardrooms and glances at every gala. But tonight, his sharpest accessory wasn't his wealth. It was the decision he had just made. Behind him, Julia Collins, his wife of 15 years, emerged from their bedroom, adjusting the cuff of her elegant silk dress. It was a deep shade of emerald, the fabric hugging her figure without trying too hard to impress. Julia had always been graceful, poised. Never the kind of woman to flaunt extravagance, but her presence had a quiet power that couldn't be ignored. She had been by Ethan's side long before his business empire had taken off, long before success had elevated them to penthouses and charity galas. Ethan, her voice was soft but firm as she walked toward him. "The car's waiting. Are you ready?" He turned to face her, his expression unreadable. For a brief moment, his eyes flicked over her, taking in the familiar elegance of the woman he once adored. But tonight, there was something different in his gaze, something colder. "I'm not going with you," Ethan said, placing the glass on the marble countertop. His tone was casual, as if he were merely discussing a business deal, but the weight of his words dropped like a stone between them. Julia blinked, her breath catching in her chest. "What do you mean?" "We're meeting the investors tonight. This is important." He walked past her, grabbing his coat from the arm of the leather sofa. "It's important, yes? That's why Brooke will be joining me." Julia's confusion morphed into disbelief, her fingers tightening around her clutch. "Brooke? Your assistant?" "Ethan, this is a meeting for executives and partners. I'm your wife. This is my role." Ethan sighed, as if her protest were nothing more than a mild inconvenience. "Julia, don't make this difficult. Brooke has the right image for tonight. She's young, vibrant. Investors like that." She took a step back, the reality of his words sinking in like ice against her skin. "The right image?" Her voice trembled slightly, but she quickly steadied herself. "So that's what I am to you now? An outdated image?" He turned to face her, his eyes narrowing. "Julia, this isn't personal. It's business." But it was personal. She could feel it in the way he dismissed her, as if she were nothing more than a relic of his past. They had built this life together, and yet here he was, erasing her from it piece by piece. For a moment, she considered fighting him, demanding that he reconsider, but something stopped her. Perhaps it was the way he had already made up his mind. Or perhaps it was the realization that fighting for a place she had earned wasn't worth the humiliation. Her heart pounded as she met his gaze, refusing to let him see how deeply he had cut her. "You'll regret this," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the storm raging inside her. Ethan chuckled, the sound low and dismissive. "I doubt it." The door clicked shut behind him, leaving Julia standing alone in the middle of the room, her reflection staring back at her from the glass windows. The silence that followed was suffocating, but she didn't cry. Not yet. Instead, she walked to the bar, poured herself a glass of wine, and sat down on the plush sofa where they had once planned their future. How ironic, she thought, that the same room now felt like a tomb for their marriage. An hour later, the clock chimed softly in the background, marking the passage of time she could no longer ignore. She had spent years playing the role of the supportive wife, the woman behind the powerful man. But tonight, as the weight of Ethan's betrayal pressed down on her, Julia felt something shift, a spark of something she hadn't felt in years. Determination. She set the wine glass aside and picked up her phone. Scrolling through her contacts, she stopped at a name she hadn't called in ages: Oliver Prescott. He was an old colleague, someone who had once admired her business acumen back when she worked alongside Ethan before stepping back to raise their family. Without overthinking it, she dialed the number. "Julia?" Oliver's voice was warm, surprised but not unpleasant. "It's been a long time." "Yes, it has," she replied, her tone measured but resolute. "I need your help." There was a pause on the other end of the line, as if he were processing the weight behind her words. "What kind of help?" "The kind that requires discretion," Julia said, standing and pacing the room. "And strategy. Ethan thinks he's won tonight, but he's underestimated me." Oliver chuckled softly, but there was an edge of seriousness beneath it. "Tell me everything." As she explained the details of the meeting Ethan was attending and the business deal he was trying to secure, Julia could feel her confidence growing. She hadn't lost her touch. She had simply been hiding it beneath years of compromise and loyalty. But no more. Ethan had chosen his assistant over her, and that was the last mistake he'd make at her expense. When the call ended, Julia stood by the window, looking out at the city lights once more. This time, they didn't mock her. They challenged her. She wasn't just Ethan Collins' discarded wife. She was Julia Collins, a woman with more knowledge of the company's inner workings than Ethan could ever imagine. And if he thought Brooke's charm was enough to secure the deal, he had forgotten one crucial thing. Julia knew how to win wars, not just battles. The sound of her phone buzzing pulled her from her thoughts. It was a text from Oliver. "Let's meet tomorrow. We'll take the first step together." She smiled, a small but significant curve of her lips. Tonight, she had lost the battle, but tomorrow, the war would begin. And this time, she wasn't fighting for him. She was fighting for herself. What would you do if someone tried to erase you from everything you helped build? Would you fight back or walk away? Let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to like the video and subscribe to see how Julia's story unfolds. You won't want to miss what's coming next. The marble floors gleamed under the soft glow of golden chandeliers in the grand, glass-walled conference room of the Vistara Hotel. Every inch of the place oozed sophistication, from the polished mahogany tables to the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city's skyline. The view was breathtaking, but tonight, all eyes were on the people in the room. The investors seated around the table weren't just the wealthy elite. They were power brokers who could make or break empires. Ethan Collins adjusted his cufflinks and leaned back in his chair, exuding confidence as though the room itself bent to his will. His presence was commanding, and for years, he had relied on that presence to seal deals without much effort. Beside him, Brooke Daniels, his personal assistant, leaned forward slightly, flashing a bright smile that had already captured the attention of two key investors. Her blonde hair fell in soft waves down her shoulders, and her crimson dress, a choice that Ethan had subtly suggested, hugged her figure perfectly. She looked like she belonged here, even though this was her first high-stakes meeting. Brooke wasn't here to negotiate or present financial data. She was here for appearances, and Ethan was keenly aware of how valuable appearances could be. Investors liked their deals wrapped in glamour. Brooke's role was to provide that final touch, and judging by the way the room had warmed to her, Ethan considered it a calculated victory. "We believe this partnership will be mutually beneficial," Ethan said smoothly, his gaze shifting across the room. "Our expansion into the Southeast Asian markets is already underway. But with your investment, we can fast-track key acquisitions and double our projected revenue by the end of next year." One of the investors, a silver-haired man with a reputation for being particularly shrewd, tapped his pen against the table. "Ambitious timeline, Mr. Collins? And who exactly will be overseeing these acquisitions?" Ethan smiled, the kind of smile that concealed just enough arrogance to seem reassuring. "Our executive team has already laid the groundwork. I'll be personally involved to ensure everything goes smoothly." The investor nodded, but his gaze drifted toward Brooke. "And who is this lovely young woman accompanying you?" Brooke blushed slightly, casting a modest glance downward before responding. "I'm Brooke Daniels. I assist Mr. Collins with business development and client relations." "She's modest," Ethan interjected with a chuckle, resting a hand briefly on her shoulder. "Brooke has been instrumental in streamlining our partnerships. Her attention to detail is unmatched. Across the table, several investors exchanged approving glances. Brooke's charm was working exactly as intended. Ethan leaned back, satisfied, as the discussion shifted to logistics and timelines. But even as the meeting progressed smoothly, there was a flicker of something else in his mind. An image of Julia. He had expected to feel relief tonight, knowing she wasn't here to remind him of their shared history or to challenge his decisions. But instead, her absence felt heavier than he had anticipated. Julia had always been the one to read between the lines, to ask the hard questions that made investors reconsider their hesitations. Without her, the room felt easier to navigate, but perhaps a little too easy. He brushed the thought away as the lead investor closed his folder and extended his hand. "We'll review the terms and get back to you within the week." Ethan shook his hand firmly. "I'm confident you'll find our proposal more than satisfactory." The meeting concluded with polite handshakes and exchanged pleasantries. Brooke looped her arm through Ethan's as they walked toward the elevator, her perfume, a light, floral scent, lingering in the air. "I think that went well," she said, glancing up at him with a pleased smile. "It did," Ethan replied, though his tone lacked the enthusiasm he usually displayed after a successful meeting. He pressed the elevator button, and as the doors slid open, he hesitated briefly before stepping inside. "Something on your mind?" Brooke asked, tilting her head. Ethan shook his head, forcing a smile. "No, just thinking about the next steps." But as the elevator descended, his thoughts drifted once again to Julia. Across town, Julia was deep in thought, seated at her kitchen table with documents spread out before her. The apartment around her was dimly lit, casting shadows that danced across the walls as the storm outside grew louder. The rain pattered against the windows, a comforting yet somber backdrop to her work. She had spent hours analyzing Ethan's proposal, noting its strengths but also its glaring weaknesses. Weaknesses she knew the investors would eventually discover. She tapped her pen against the table, her mind racing. Ethan had always relied on surface-level charm to get by, but this deal required more than charm. It required foresight, a quality he had long neglected, assuming others would fill in the gaps for him. Her phone buzzed, and she saw a message from Oliver. "Did you find anything interesting?" Julia smiled faintly and typed back, "More than I expected. Let's meet tomorrow to finalize the strategy." She set the phone aside and leaned back, exhaling deeply. There was a time when she would have hesitated to make a move like this, when loyalty to Ethan would have kept her tethered. But those days were gone. He had made it clear where she stood in his life, and she had no intention of being anyone's second choice. Her gaze drifted to a framed photo on the bookshelf, a picture of her and Ethan from their early years, standing in front of their first apartment with wide grins and hopeful eyes. She felt a pang of nostalgia, but it was quickly replaced by resolve. The woman in that photo had been full of dreams, but she had also been naive. Now, she was older, wiser, and ready to reclaim what was rightfully hers. The next morning, as dawn broke through the clouds, Julia was already up, reviewing notes and preparing for her meeting with Oliver. The smell of freshly brewed coffee filled the apartment, and for the first time in weeks, she felt a sense of purpose that went beyond survival. By the time she arrived at Oliver's office, the city was awake, bustling with energy. The sleek, modern decor of the office mirrored Oliver's personality, polished, efficient, and always one step ahead. He greeted her with a warm smile and a cup of coffee, which she accepted gratefully. "Looks like you've been busy," Oliver said, gesturing to the stack of papers in her hands. "You have no idea," Julia replied, sitting down across from him. "Ethan's proposal is good, but it's missing key elements that the investors will notice eventually. If we move quickly, we can present a better alternative." Oliver leaned forward, his interest piqued. "What's your plan?" Julia outlined her strategy, her voice steady and confident. She detailed how they could leverage her knowledge of Ethan's business practices to highlight the weaknesses in his plan while simultaneously offering a more comprehensive solution. Oliver listened intently, nodding as she spoke. "You've thought this through," he said, clearly impressed. "I've had a lot of time to think," Julia replied, her gaze unwavering. "Ethan thinks I'm out of the game, but he doesn't realize I've been studying his every move." Oliver chuckled. He's about to find out. Julia smiled, but her mind was already racing ahead to the next steps. She knew this wouldn't be easy. Ethan wasn't the type to take defeat gracefully. But she also knew that this wasn't just about proving him wrong. It was about proving to herself that she was capable of rebuilding her life on her own terms. As she left Oliver's office, the morning sun bathed the city in golden light, casting long shadows across the pavement. Julia took a deep breath, letting the crisp air fill her lungs. She had spent too long living in the shadows of someone else's success. Now, it was her turn to shine. She pulled out her phone and sent a message to Oliver. "Let's schedule the presentation for Friday. I want everything ready by then." As the message sent, she felt a sense of anticipation that was almost electric. She wasn't just preparing for a business meeting. She was preparing for a reckoning. And this time, she wouldn't be the one left behind. The rain had eased overnight, leaving the city slick with a reflective sheen as morning light peeked through thinning clouds. Julia Collins stepped out of the cafe, her coffee cup warm between her fingers, and paused for a moment on the sidewalk. The world felt different today, and it wasn't just because the storm had passed. She could feel it in her bones, a sense of momentum, as though the universe had finally shifted in her favor. The cafe door swung shut behind her with a soft chime, and she made her way down the street toward her apartment. Her heels clicked against the wet pavement, echoing softly in the morning stillness. She was no longer the woman who had hesitated to fight back, who had let herself be sidelined in her own life. Today, she had a plan, and she wasn't about to let sentimentality or fear hold her back. Inside her apartment, the warm smell of lavender lingered in the air, a subtle reminder of the bath she had taken the night before to calm her nerves. The small space, while a far cry from the sprawling mansion she once called home, had become her sanctuary. Here, she could think without Ethan's presence looming over her. She set her coffee on the kitchen counter and opened her laptop, the soft hum of the device blending with the distant hum of city life outside her window. Her fingers moved quickly across the keyboard as she compiled the last few notes for the presentation she and Oliver were preparing. Every detail had been meticulously crafted to address the gaps in Ethan's proposal, offering a solution that the investors wouldn't be able to ignore. As the morning wore on, sunlight filtered through the blinds, casting golden stripes across the living room floor. Julia's focus was unshakable, her mind a flurry of strategies, contingencies, and possibilities. She was halfway through revising the financial projections when her phone buzzed with a message from Oliver. "Be here by noon. We'll finalize everything." Julia glanced at the clock. It was already 11 a.m. She quickly closed her laptop, grabbed her coat, and headed out the door. As she hailed a cab, she couldn't help but marvel at how quickly things had changed. Just days ago, she had been spiraling, unsure of her next move. Now, she was on the offensive, and it felt exhilarating. The cab ride was a blur of honking horns and bustling pedestrians as the city pulsed with its usual energy. Julia's thoughts were consumed with what lay ahead, replaying conversations and rehearsing responses to potential objections the investors might raise. By the time the cab pulled up outside Oliver's office building, she was ready. Oliver greeted her at the entrance with his characteristic charm, a quick smile and a warm handshake that instantly put her at ease. His office, perched on the 20th floor, had a panoramic view of the city that reminded her of Ethan's penthouse, but with a less imposing vibe. Here, the atmosphere was collaborative, not suffocating. "Come in," Oliver said, gesturing toward a sleek conference table where papers were already spread out. "I've gone through the initial draft you sent last night. It's good, really good, but we'll need to tighten a few sections." Julia nodded, setting her bag down and slipping into the chair across from him. "Let's do it." They spent the next 2 hours fine-tuning every aspect of the presentation. Oliver's expertise in finance complemented Julia's strategic vision, and together, they created a pitch that not only highlighted Ethan's weaknesses but also demonstrated how Julia's alternative plan would mitigate risks and maximize returns. By the time they finished, the presentation felt bulletproof. Oliver leaned back in his chair and stretched, a satisfied grin spreading across his face. "You know, Ethan really has no idea what's coming," Julia smirked, tapping her pen against the table. "He underestimated me." That's always been his mistake. Do you think he'll try to retaliate once he realizes you've taken over the deal? Oliver asked, his tone curious but cautious. Oh, I'm counting on it, Julia said, her gaze steady. But that's the thing about people like Ethan. They react emotionally when they feel threatened. He won't see this as a business move. He'll see it as personal, and that's exactly what will throw him off his game. Oliver chuckled, clearly impressed by her insight. You've thought of everything. I had to, she replied, her voice softening slightly. When someone rips your life apart, you learn to pay attention to the details. They shared a moment of silence before Oliver leaned forward again, his expression serious. Julia, I want you to know that whatever happens next, you're not alone in this. I've got your back. The sincerity in his voice caught her off guard, and for a brief moment, she felt the weight of everything she had been carrying. The betrayal, the humiliation, the fear of failure. But she quickly pushed those feelings aside, locking them away where they couldn't distract her. Thank you, Oliver, she said, offering a small but genuine smile. That means more than you know. As they wrapped up their meeting, Oliver handed her a binder containing the finalized proposal. I'll handle the logistics of setting up the presentation. You just focus on being the powerhouse you are. Julia laughed, a sound that felt foreign but welcome. Deal. She left the office with a renewed sense of purpose, the weight in her chest slowly lifting as she made her way back to the street. The city's noise surrounded her, but instead of feeling overwhelmed, she felt invigorated. For the first time in years, she wasn't defined by Ethan's decisions or his perception of her worth. She was carving out her own path, and there was no turning back. Later that evening, Julia sat at her kitchen table, a glass of wine in hand as she reviewed the final details one last time. The apartment was quiet, save for the faint hum of the refrigerator and the occasional honk of a car horn outside. She had always found comfort in moments like this, when the world seemed to pause, allowing her to catch her breath and gather her thoughts. Her phone buzzed, and she saw a message from Emma, her 14-year-old niece who often checked in on her since the divorce. Aunt Jules, how's your day been? Julia smiled, quickly typing back, eventful, but good. I'll tell you all about it soon. As she set the phone down, her thoughts drifted to Ethan. She wondered how long it would take him to realize that the deal was slipping out of his grasp, that the woman he had dismissed as an outdated accessory was now a threat he couldn't ignore. The thought filled her with a mix of satisfaction and anticipation. She wasn't seeking revenge, but she wasn't about to let him walk away unscathed either. Finishing her wine, Julia leaned back in her chair and stared at the ceiling, letting the day's events wash over her. Tomorrow would be another challenge, but she was ready for it. She had spent too long waiting for someone to give her permission to succeed. Now, she was giving herself that permission, and if Ethan wanted to stand in her way, he would soon learn just how much power she truly held. The night sky hung over the city like a velvet curtain, its darkness interrupted only by the glowing skyline and the soft hum of passing traffic. The restaurant chosen for tonight's investor dinner was situated on the 50th floor of a luxury high-rise, its walls of glass offering panoramic views that made even the most seasoned business moguls pause in admiration. Inside, crystal chandeliers reflected off polished floors, casting golden light across tables adorned with fine china and flickering candles. It was the kind of venue where deals worth millions, or sometimes billions, were made over exquisite cuisine and vintage wine. Ethan Collins sat at the head of the table, exuding confidence in his tailored navy suit, the fabric hugging his frame with precision. His tie, a muted shade of blue, was meticulously knotted, a small but deliberate choice to project a sense of understated authority. He had always understood the power of presentation, and tonight, he intended to wield it with finesse. His gaze scanned the table, where a group of investors and executives engaged in light conversation while sipping from crystal goblets. Across from him, Brooke Daniels, his ever-charming personal assistant, sat poised with perfect posture, a glass of Chardonnay resting delicately in her hand. The evening had been carefully orchestrated. The investors had been impressed by the presentation earlier that day, and Ethan was certain tonight's dinner would solidify their interest. As he leaned back in his chair, a faint smirk curved his lips. Everything was going according to plan. until the doors of the restaurant opened and Julia Collins walked in. She was a vision of quiet elegance, her black dress hugging her figure in all the right places, with a slit that hinted at sophistication rather than excess. Her hair, styled in loose waves, framed her face, and her makeup was subtle but striking, just enough to make people take notice without overshadowing her natural beauty. The soft click of her heels against the marble floor drew attention, and as heads turned, the hum of conversation faded momentarily. Ethan's hand froze on the stem of his wine glass, his knuckles whitening. His mind raced as he tried to process her unexpected presence. She was supposed to be at home, far removed from this world he had pushed her out of. What was she doing here? Brooke shifted uncomfortably in her seat, glancing at Ethan for guidance, but he remained motionless, his gaze locked on Julia as she made her way toward the table. Her smile was serene, almost playful, as if she had anticipated this exact reaction. "Julia," Ethan finally managed, his voice cool but strained. "I wasn't expecting you." She placed a hand on the back of an empty chair, her fingers tracing its edge as she tilted her head slightly. "I know. That's what makes this so fun." Her eyes sparkled with a mixture of amusement and something darker, something he couldn't quite place. One of the investors, a distinguished older man seated near the center of the table, cleared his throat and gestured toward the empty chair. "Please join us, Miss Collins. We'd be honored to have you." "Thank you, Mr. Blackwell," Julia replied graciously, sliding into the seat with effortless grace. "I didn't mean to intrude. I was just nearby and thought I'd stop by to congratulate Ethan on the presentation today." Her words dripped with subtle condescension, and Ethan felt his pulse quicken. He knew her well enough to recognize the underlying challenge. Julia wasn't here to congratulate him. She was here to prove a point. Brooke's eyes darted between them, her discomfort growing as she sensed the tension. She leaned toward Ethan and whispered, "Should I handle this?" "No," he replied through clenched teeth. "Let her play her game." The waiter arrived to take Julia's order, and she selected a glass of red wine without missing a beat. As the conversation resumed around the table, Julia seamlessly integrated herself into the discussion, offering thoughtful insights on market trends and acquisition strategies. The investors, who had initially regarded her as a polite but irrelevant guest, quickly realized she wasn't just another pretty face. In fact, her knowledge of the company's inner workings rivaled Ethan's, and within minutes, she had captured the room's attention. Even Mr. Blackwell, who had been skeptical of Ethan's aggressive expansion plans earlier that day, seemed genuinely interested in what Julia had to say. "Your perspective is refreshing, Ms. Collins," Blackwell said, leaning forward slightly. "It's rare to meet someone who understands both the financial and operational aspects of a business this size." Julia smiled, her gaze flicking briefly toward Ethan before returning to Blackwell. "Well, I spent years working behind the scenes. It gives you a unique vantage point, one that's often overlooked." Ethan's jaw tightened. He could feel the control slipping through his fingers, and it infuriated him. Julia was undoing months of careful planning with nothing more than her presence and a few well-placed remarks. Brooke attempted to steer the conversation back to Ethan, mentioning their recent success with a regional partnership. But the investors seemed more interested in Julia's take on the long-term sustainability of such deals. "Would you say the current expansion plan is sustainable, given the risks involved in foreign markets?" one of the investors asked, directing the question to Julia instead of Ethan. She paused, as if considering her response carefully. "Expansion is necessary for growth, but only if it's supported by infrastructure and local partnerships. Without those, you're gambling with your reputation and resources." Her answer was precise, well-informed, and impossible to refute. Ethan could feel the weight of her words settling over the table like a storm cloud. The investors nodded in agreement, and he realized with a sinking feeling that Julia had done more damage in one evening than he had anticipated. When the main course was served, Ethan excused himself under the pretense of taking a call. He stepped onto the balcony, the cool night air biting against his skin as he pulled out his phone and stared at the screen without dialing. His mind was spinning, a chaotic mess of anger, confusion, and something dangerously close to fear. He heard the soft click of heels behind him and turned to find Julia standing there, Her arms crossed loosely over her chest. The city lights reflected in her eyes, making them seem brighter, more piercing. "What are you doing, Julia?" he demanded, his voice low but sharp. "Why are you here?" She tilted her head, a small smile playing on her lips. "You didn't think I'd just disappear, did you? After everything we've been through, you really thought I'd let you erase me like I never existed? This isn't the place for this," he snapped, his control slipping further. "Oh, I disagree," she said, stepping closer. "This is exactly the place for this. You brought me into this world, Ethan. You taught me the rules, and now you're upset because I'm playing the game better than you?" He took a step back, the weight of her words cutting deeper than he cared to admit. She was right, of course. He had spent years molding her, encouraging her to understand the intricacies of business while simultaneously keeping her in the shadows. And now, the student had become the master. Julia leaned in, her voice soft but deadly. "Enjoy the rest of your evening, Ethan. I have a feeling things are about to get interesting." With that, she turned and walked back inside, leaving him alone on the balcony with the realization that he had underestimated her once again. The night sky hung over the city like a velvet curtain, its darkness interrupted only by the glowing skyline and the soft hum of passing traffic. The restaurant chosen for tonight's investor dinner was situated on the 50th floor of a luxury high-rise, its walls of glass offering panoramic views that made even the most seasoned business moguls pause in admiration. Inside, crystal chandeliers reflected off polished floors, casting golden light across tables adorned with fine china and flickering candles. It was the kind of venue where deals worth millions, or sometimes billions, were made over exquisite cuisine and vintage wine. Ethan Collins sat at the head of the table, exuding confidence in his tailored navy suit, the fabric hugging his frame with precision. His tie, a muted shade of blue, was meticulously knotted, a small but deliberate choice to project a sense of understated authority. He had always understood the power of presentation, and tonight, he intended to wield it with finesse. His gaze scanned the table, where a group of investors and executives engaged in light conversation while sipping from crystal goblets. Across from him, Brooke Daniels, his ever-charming personal assistant, sat poised with perfect posture, a glass of Chardonnay resting delicately in her hand. The evening had been carefully orchestrated. The investors had been impressed by the presentation earlier that day, and Ethan was certain tonight's dinner would solidify their interest. As he leaned back in his chair, a faint smirk curved his lips. Everything was going according to plan, until the doors of the restaurant opened and Julia Collins walked in. She was a vision of quiet elegance, her black dress hugging her figure in all the right places, with a slit that hinted at sophistication rather than excess. Her hair, styled in loose waves, framed her face, and her makeup was subtle but striking, just enough to make people take notice without overshadowing her natural beauty. The soft click of her heels against the marble floor drew attention, and as heads turned, the hum of conversation faded momentarily. Ethan's hand froze on the stem of his wine glass, his knuckles whitening. His mind raced as he tried to process her unexpected presence. She was supposed to be at home, far removed from this world he had pushed her out of. What was she doing here? Brooke shifted uncomfortably in her seat, glancing at Ethan for guidance, but he remained motionless, his gaze locked on Julia as she made her way toward the table. Her smile was serene, almost playful, as if she had anticipated this exact reaction. "Julia," Ethan finally managed, his voice cool but strained. "I wasn't expecting you." She placed a hand on the back of an empty chair, her fingers tracing its edge as she tilted her head slightly. "I know. That's what makes this so fun." Her eyes sparkled with a mixture of amusement and something darker, something he couldn't quite place. One of the investors, a distinguished older man seated near the center of the table, cleared his throat and gestured toward the empty chair. "Please join us, Miss Collins. We'd be honored to have you." "Thank you, Mr. Blackwell," Julia replied graciously, sliding into the seat with effortless grace. "I didn't mean to intrude. I was just nearby and thought I'd stop by to congratulate Ethan on the presentation today." Her words dripped with subtle condescension, and Ethan felt his pulse quicken. He knew her well enough to recognize the underlying challenge. Julia wasn't here to congratulate him. She was here to prove a point. Brooke's eyes darted between them, her discomfort growing as she sensed the tension. She leaned toward Ethan and whispered, "Should I handle this?" "No," he replied through clenched teeth. "Let her play her game." The waiter arrived to take Julia's order, and she selected a glass of red wine without missing a beat. As the conversation resumed around the table, Julia seamlessly integrated herself into the discussion, offering thoughtful insights on market trends and acquisition strategies. The investors, who had initially regarded her as a polite but irrelevant guest, quickly realized she wasn't just another pretty face. In fact, her knowledge of the company's inner workings rivaled Ethan's, and within minutes, she had captured the room's attention. Even Mr. Blackwell, who had been skeptical of Ethan's aggressive expansion plans earlier that day, seemed genuinely interested in what Julia had to say. "Your perspective is refreshing, Ms. Collins," Blackwell said, leaning forward slightly. "It's rare to meet someone who understands both the financial and operational aspects of a business this size." Julia smiled, her gaze flicking briefly toward Ethan before returning to Blackwell. "Well, I spent years working behind the scenes. It gives you a unique vantage point, one that's often overlooked." Ethan's jaw tightened. He could feel the control slipping through his fingers, and it infuriated him. Julia was undoing months of careful planning with nothing more than her presence and a few well-placed remarks. Brooke attempted to steer the conversation back to Ethan, mentioning their recent success with a regional partnership. But the investors seemed more interested in Julia's take on the long-term sustainability of such deals. "Would you say the current expansion plan is sustainable, given the risks involved in foreign markets?" one of the investors asked, directing the question to Julia instead of Ethan. She paused, as if considering her response carefully. "Expansion is necessary for growth, but only if it's supported by infrastructure and local partnerships. Without those, you're gambling with your reputation and resources." Her answer was precise, well-informed, and impossible to refute. Ethan could feel the weight of her words settling over the table like a storm cloud. The investors nodded in agreement, and he realized with a sinking feeling that Julia had done more damage in one evening than he had anticipated. When the main course was served, Ethan excused himself under the pretense of taking a call. He stepped onto the balcony, the cool night air biting against his skin as he pulled out his phone and stared at the screen without dialing. His mind was spinning, a chaotic mess of anger, confusion, and something dangerously close to fear. He heard the soft click of heels behind him and turned to find Julia standing there, her arms crossed loosely over her chest. The city lights reflected in her eyes, making them seem brighter, more piercing. "What are you doing, Julia?" he demanded, his voice low but sharp. "Why are you here?" She tilted her head, a small smile playing on her lips. "You didn't think I'd just disappear, did you? After everything we've been through, you really thought I'd let you erase me like I never existed? This isn't the place for this," he snapped, his control slipping further. "Oh, I disagree," she said, stepping closer. "This is exactly the place for this. You brought me into this world, Ethan. You taught me the rules, and now you're upset because I'm playing the game better than you?" He took a step back, the weight of her words cutting deeper than he cared to admit. She was right, of course. He had spent years molding her, encouraging her to understand the intricacies of business while simultaneously keeping her in the shadows. And now, the student had become the master. Julia leaned in, her voice soft but deadly. "Enjoy the rest of your evening, Ethan. I have a feeling things are about to get interesting." With that, she turned and walked back inside, leaving him alone on the balcony with the realization that he had underestimated her once again. The sound of the city seemed muted inside Ethan Collins' office, despite the constant hum of traffic that usually filled the space. It was the same office where he had signed million-dollar deals, toasted victories, and built a reputation as a man who never lost. But today, the weight of failure hung in the air, suffocating him. His desk, usually neat and orderly, was now littered with documents, contracts, spreadsheets, and half-empty coffee cups. His tie had been loosened, his once pristine white shirt wrinkled from hours of restless pacing. Ethan stood by the window, staring out at the skyline without really seeing it. The phone call from Mr. Blackwell had come earlier that morning, and its message had been crystal clear. The investors were seriously considering Julia's proposal over his. They hadn't made their final decision yet, but the mere fact that Julia had presented an alternative plan, and that it had been well received, was enough to shake him to his core. He clenched his fists, the muscles in his jaw tightening as he replayed the events of the last few days. He had underestimated her. He had thought that pushing her aside and replacing her with Brooke would be the end of it, but Julia had blindsided him. She wasn't the timid woman he had assumed she'd remain after the divorce. No, she was proving to be something far more dangerous. A woman with nothing to lose and everything to gain. Brooke entered the office cautiously, her heels clicking softly against the hardwood floor. She carried a tablet under one arm and a worried expression on her face. "Ethan," she said, her voice gentle, "we need to talk about damage control." He turned to face her, his eyes cold. "I don't need you telling me what I already know." Brooke flinched slightly but didn't back down. "I'm just trying to help. If we act quickly, we can." "Help?" Ethan cut her off, his voice rising. "You were supposed to be the perfect addition to my team. The one who could charm investors and make them forget their concerns. Instead, you've been sitting here while Julia dismantles everything I've built." Brooke's eyes narrowed, and for the first time, she didn't try to placate him. "Maybe if you hadn't dismissed her so easily, we wouldn't be in this mess." Ethan's face hardened, but he didn't respond. Instead, he turned back to the window, his reflection staring back at him like a ghost. He could feel the cracks in his carefully constructed world widening, threatening to swallow him whole. "I need to fix this," he muttered, more to himself than to Brooke. "How?" Brooke asked, crossing her arms. "The investors trust Julia now. She knows your company inside and out. What's your plan, Ethan?" He didn't have an answer, and the silence between them stretched uncomfortably. After a moment, Brooke sighed and placed the tablet on his desk. "Maybe it's time you start considering that she's not the enemy you think she is." Ethan laughed bitterly. "She's not the enemy? She's trying to take everything from me." "No," Brooke said quietly. "She's just taking back what you took from her." Her words hit him like a punch to the gut, and for a moment, he couldn't breathe. He had always framed Julia as the one who needed him, the one who couldn't succeed without his guidance. But now, faced with the reality of her competence and resilience, he realized how deeply he had misjudged her. Brooke left the office without another word, the door clicking shut behind her. Ethan sank into his chair, running his hands through his hair as he tried to think of a way out of the mess he had created. His mind raced with possibilities, but none of them seemed viable. Julia had outmaneuvered him, and the investors had seen through the facade he had built. He had spent so much time perfecting the image of a man in control that he hadn't noticed the foundation cracking beneath him. Desperation clawed at him, and before he could stop himself, he picked up his phone and dialed Julia's number. The phone rang twice before she answered. "Ethan," she said, her voice calm and composed, as if she had been expecting his call. "I need to see you," he said, his words rushing out before he could second-guess them. There was a brief pause on the other end of the line. "Why?" "Because we need to talk," he replied, his tone more pleading than he intended. "Face to face." Another pause and then, "Fine. My apartment." 1 hour. The line went dead, and Ethan exhaled shakily. He wasn't sure what he hoped to achieve with this meeting, but he knew one thing. He couldn't let her win without a fight. Exactly an hour later, Ethan stood outside Julia's apartment building, the crisp autumn air nipping at his skin. He pressed the buzzer, and the door unlocked with a soft click. As he made his way up the stairs, his heart pounded with a mixture of anxiety and frustration. He had faced boardrooms filled with ruthless executives, negotiated multi-million-dollar deals, and weathered corporate storms, but standing outside Julia's door felt like the most daunting challenge of his life. The door opened before he could knock, and there she was, Julia, standing in the doorway with an air of quiet confidence. She wore a simple blouse and tailored slacks, her hair pulled back in a loose bun. There was no sign of the woman who had once relied on him for direction. This Julia was self-assured, her gaze steady and unyielding. "Come in," she said, stepping aside to let him enter. The apartment was cozy and warm, with the faint scent of lavender lingering in the air. Ethan took a seat on the sofa, but Julia remained standing, her arms crossed as she watched him carefully. "What do you want, Ethan?" she asked, her tone devoid of the warmth it once held. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "I want to understand how we got here." Julia raised an eyebrow. "You don't already know?" "I made mistakes," he admitted, the words tasting bitter on his tongue. "I underestimated you. I thought you'd stay in the background, but I was wrong." She sighed and walked over to the window, her gaze fixed on the city below. "You didn't just underestimate me, Ethan. You erased me. For years, I supported you, worked behind the scenes to help build your success, and you discarded me like I was nothing." "I know," he said softly. "I know I hurt you." Julia turned to face him, her expression unreadable. "And now you're here because you think I can help you fix this." He didn't deny it. "Yes, I need your help." She laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "Ethan, the irony is almost poetic. You built your empire by casting me aside, and now you want me to save it. I'll do whatever it takes," he said, desperation creeping into his voice. "We can rebuild this together." Julia shook her head slowly. "You don't get to ask for that, not after everything." Silence filled the room, heavy and suffocating. Ethan felt the weight of her rejection like a blow to the chest, but he knew she was right. He had taken too much, and now he had nothing left to offer her. "I'm sorry," he whispered. Julia walked over to the door and opened it. "You should go." Ethan stood, his shoulders slumped in defeat. He paused briefly, as if searching for the right words, but none came. Without another word, he stepped outside, the door closing behind him with a finality that echoed through his bones. The morning was crisp and clear, with sunlight streaming through the massive windows of the investment firm's headquarters, casting golden rays across the polished marble floors. Executives in tailored suits moved briskly through the hallways, their conversations punctuated by the clicking of heels and the rustling of papers. Today was important, and the weight of that importance was felt in every corner of the building. At the center of the activity, the conference room on the top floor was abuzz with anticipation. The walls were lined with sleek glass panels, and the large oak table in the middle was flanked by high-backed leather chairs. Several executives and key investors had already gathered, murmuring among themselves as they reviewed the agenda. At the head of the table sat Mr. Blackwell, his fingers drumming lightly against the table as he waited for the final attendees to arrive. Julia Collins entered the room with a calm, composed air, her tailored black dress and understated jewelry adding to her aura of quiet power. She wasn't just a participant today, she was the centerpiece. Heads turned as she walked toward her seat, and although she maintained her usual grace, there was a fire in her eyes that hadn't been there before. She was ready. She greeted Mr. Blackwell with a firm handshake before taking her place at the table. "Good morning," she said, her voice steady but warm. "Thank you all for being here." The others nodded politely, their expressions ranging from curiosity to cautious respect. The air crackled with the energy of anticipation, as if everyone present could sense that something monumental was about to unfold. Just as the meeting was about to begin, the glass doors at the far end of the room swung open, and Ethan Collins walked in. He was dressed impeccably, as always, in a dark suit and silk tie, but there was something different about him today, an underlying tension, a hint of desperation in the way he carried himself. His gaze swept across the room, briefly meeting Julia's before he took the seat directly across from her. "Apologies for the delay," Ethan said smoothly, though his voice lacked its usual confidence. "Let's get started." Mr. Blackwell cleared his throat and addressed the room. "As you all know, we're here to finalize our decision regarding the expansion proposal. Both Ethan and Julia have presented compelling cases, and today, we'll be discussing the key aspects before making our final determination." Julia sat perfectly still, her hands folded neatly on the table. She could feel Ethan's eyes on her, but she didn't acknowledge him. Instead, she focused on the task at hand, knowing that her success didn't depend on rattling him. It depended on her ability to demonstrate why her plan was superior. The discussion began with a review of the financial projections. Julia listened carefully as one of the analysts outlined the differences between her plan and Ethan's. As expected, Ethan's proposal was centered on rapid growth and aggressive market penetration, while Julia's plan prioritized sustainable expansion and risk management. When the analyst concluded his presentation, Mr. Blackwell turned to Julia. Ms. Collins, could you elaborate on how your approach to local partnerships mitigates risk compared to Ethan's strategy? Of course, Julia replied, her tone measured and confident. By partnering with established local entities, we're leveraging their existing infrastructure and market knowledge. This minimizes the costs associated with entering new markets while reducing the likelihood of unforeseen obstacles. Additionally, these partnerships create a built-in support system, allowing us to adapt to changing conditions more effectively. Ethan leaned forward, his expression hardening. But isn't there a risk of becoming too dependent on local partners? If they fail, wouldn't that jeopardize the entire expansion? Julia didn't miss a beat. That's a valid concern, but we've accounted for it by diversifying our partnerships across multiple regions. No single partner will have the power to derail the project. Moreover, our contracts include performance benchmarks and exit clauses to protect us in the event of underperformance. A murmur of approval rippled through the room, and Ethan's jaw tightened. He was losing control of the narrative, and he knew it. The conversation shifted to operational logistics, and Julia continued to hold her ground, addressing every question with precision and clarity. Ethan attempted to counter her points several times, but each time, Julia's responses were backed by data and strategic foresight. She wasn't just answering questions. She was dismantling his arguments piece by piece. As the discussion drew to a close, Mr. Blackwell leaned back in his chair and steepled his fingers. Before we move to a vote, does anyone have any final questions or comments? The room fell silent, and for a moment, it seemed as though the decision had already been made. But then, Ethan spoke. I'd like to say something, he began, his gaze fixed on Julia. While I acknowledge the thoroughness of Julia's proposal, I believe it's important to remember the bigger picture. Rapid growth may come with risks, but it also comes with rewards. We can't afford to be overly cautious in a market that's evolving this quickly. Julia met his gaze, her expression unreadable. Ethan, there's a difference between being cautious and being strategic. My plan isn't about avoiding risks. It's about managing them. The goal is sustainable growth, not short-term gains that could jeopardize the company's future. Ethan opened his mouth to respond, but before he could speak, Mr. Blackwell raised a hand. Thank you, Ethan. I think we've heard enough. The tension in the room was palpable as Mr. Blackwell exchanged glances with the other investors. After a brief, whispered discussion, he turned back to face the group. We've reviewed both proposals thoroughly, and while we appreciate the effort that went into both, we believe that Julia's plan offers the most viable path forward. It addresses key risks while maintaining realistic growth targets, and its emphasis on local partnerships sets it apart. A wave of relief washed over Julia, but she maintained her composure, nodding graciously as the decision was finalized. We'll be moving forward with Julia's proposal, Blackwell continued. Congratulations, Ms. Collins. Thank you, Julia replied, her voice steady. I look forward to working with all of you to make this a success. The meeting adjourned, and the room began to empty as the investors filed out, offering Julia brief congratulations on their way out. Ethan remained seated, his hands clenched into fists on the table. When the last of the investors had left, he stood and approached her. This isn't over, he said, his voice low and dangerous. Julia gathered her materials and looked up at him, her gaze unwavering. It is for me. With that, she turned and walked toward the door, her heels clicking against the marble floor. As she stepped into the hallway, the sunlight streaming through the windows felt warmer, brighter, as though the world itself was acknowledging her victory. She didn't look back. There was no need to. The ballroom shimmered under the glow of chandeliers, their crystals scattering light like fragments of a forgotten dream. The air was perfumed with expensive colognes and floral arrangements as guests mingled, glasses of champagne clinking in a symphony of elegance. It was a night meant to celebrate success, influence, and wealth. An exclusive charity gala attended by CEOs, investors, and the elite of society. The kind of night where appearances mattered as much as the cause they pretended to support. Ethan Collins stood near the bar, his fingers wrapped tightly around a glass of whiskey. His suit, custom-tailored and impeccably pressed, was the only part of him that remained composed. Inside, he was unraveling. The past week had been a series of blows, losing the investors, the deal, and the control he had always taken for granted. He had spent days trying to salvage what he could, reaching out to allies who now seemed more distant than ever, their once friendly voices filled with polite excuses and vague promises. His gaze drifted across the room until it landed on Julia Collins. She was standing near the grand staircase, her laughter mingling with the soft strains of the string quartet. She wore a floor-length emerald dress that seemed to shimmer with each step she took, and her hair was swept into a soft updo that framed her face perfectly. She looked radiant, untouchable, like a woman who had not only survived the storm but emerged stronger because of it. And she wasn't alone. Beside her stood Mr. Blackwell, their conversation animated as they shared a private joke. Julia's hand rested lightly on his arm, a gesture that seemed casual but held a deeper significance, one that wasn't lost on Ethan. She had secured not only the deal, but also the respect of the most influential figures in the room. The very people who had once admired him were now gravitating toward her, their attention fixed on the woman he had dismissed. He downed the rest of his drink, the burn of the whiskey doing little to dull the sting of humiliation. As he set the empty glass on the bar, he felt a hand on his shoulder. Turning, he found Brooke standing behind him, her expression a mixture of concern and regret. "You don't have to stay," she said softly. "We can leave if this is too much." Ethan shook his head, a bitter smile curving his lips. "Leaving would only make it worse." Brooke hesitated before nodding. "If you need anything, I'll be around." As she walked away, Ethan's attention returned to Julia. He watched as she moved gracefully through the crowd, stopping to greet acquaintances and accept compliments with practiced ease. Every interaction was a reminder of her triumph, and every smile she gave felt like another nail in the coffin of his pride. Unable to take it any longer, Ethan crossed the room, weaving through the crowd until he stood directly in front of her. The noise around them seemed to fade as they locked eyes, the weight of everything unsaid hanging between them. "Julia," he said, his voice low but charged with emotion. "We need to talk." She arched an eyebrow, her expression calm but wary. "Here? Now?" "Yes," he insisted, his fingers twitching at his sides. "Please." Mr. Blackwell, sensing the tension, excused himself politely and walked away, leaving them alone in the center of the ballroom. Julia sighed and gestured toward the balcony. "Fine, let's talk." They stepped outside, the cool night air wrapping around them like a second skin. The city sparkled below, its lights twinkling like distant stars. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Ethan leaned against the railing, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "I don't know what you want me to say," he finally admitted. "I made mistakes. I know that. But you didn't have to humiliate me like this." Julia crossed her arms, leaning back against the railing as she studied him. "Humiliate you? You think this is about humiliation? What else would it be?" His voice cracked slightly, betraying the vulnerability he had tried so hard to suppress. "You've taken everything, Julia. The deal, the investors, the respect of people I've spent years building relationships with. What more do you want?" "I want what you took from me," she said quietly. "Do you even understand what that is, Ethan? It's not just about the business or the deal. You took my confidence, my sense of self-worth. You made me believe that I was only valuable as long as I stood in your shadow. And now that I've found my way out of it, you think I'm the villain? I didn't mean..." He stopped himself, running a hand through his hair. "I didn't mean for things to get this far." "But they did," Julia said, her voice soft but firm. "And you don't get to decide how far I take this." The weight of her words settled over him like a heavy blanket, suffocating and inescapable. He had always seen himself as the one in control, the one who dictated the terms of every relationship and deal. But now, standing before Julia, he realized that control was an illusion, one he had clung to for far too long. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his eyes pleading. "I know that's not enough, but I am." Julia's gaze softened for a brief moment, but then she straightened, the steel in her spine returning. I believe you, Ethan. But that doesn't change anything. Can't we fix this? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Can't we go back to the way things were? She shook her head slowly, her expression one of both sadness and resolve. No, Ethan. The way things were is exactly what I'm leaving behind. I'm not the woman who will fight for your approval anymore. I've learned to fight for myself. Silence stretched between them, broken only by the distant sounds of the city below. Ethan wanted to say more, to plead his case, but he knew it was futile. The woman standing in front of him wasn't the same woman he had once known. She had evolved, grown beyond him, and no amount of apologies could change that. Julia stepped closer, her hand brushing against his arm briefly before pulling away. I hope you find your way, Ethan. I really do. But my path doesn't include you anymore. With that, she turned and walked back inside, leaving him alone on the balcony with the weight of her words pressing down on him like an anchor. He watched her disappear into the crowd, her laughter mingling with the music as she moved seamlessly back into the world that had once been his. Ethan leaned against the railing, the cool metal biting into his palms. The city stretched out before him, vibrant and alive. But for the first time in his life, he felt small, like a man who had built a fortress only to watch it crumble under the weight of his own arrogance. He stayed on the balcony long after the gala had ended, long after the lights inside had dimmed. And when he finally left, the only thing he carried with him was the bitter taste of regret.